So yesterday, Douglas Murray, who is this famed author, he wrote the book "The Madness of Crowds," and I forget the name of the other one about immigration in Europe, "The Strange Death of Europe." I think that's the name of it. I actually read both of them. I own both of them, as a matter of fact, and I thought they were very good, very well written, very well researched. And the guy, in his public appearances, he always says things that I pretty much agree with. I mean, basically, he's against the whole woke nonsense. He is against unrestricted immigration because he thinks that it's bad for both parties, as a matter of fact. I mean, there are a lot of things that I completely agree with him on, and me being a hardcore conservative, I look at him and I say, yeah, he's like on my page, no problem. And yesterday, Sunday, he wrote a front page article that appeared in the New York Post. Now, the New York Post, for those of you who don't know the minutiae of American news media, the New York Post is a conservative newspaper in the United States. It's one of the few conservative newspapers in the United States. And they were the one who broke the Hunter Biden laptop story that got suppressed by the tech oligarchies. Okay, just before the 2020 election. The New York Post, it's like a daily tabloid, but it's not so like dumb. It's just a tabloid. Okay, it does report serious news, and the fact that they put this article by Douglas Murray on the front page was a big deal. And the article said basically that Ukraine is winning, so we should support them. Now, this is important. Because, you see, there's set in Ukraine fatigue in the West. And people are a little bit sick and tired of Zelensky. They're sick and tired of sending money and weapons to the Zelensky regime because a lot of countries in Europe and certainly in North America, Canada, the United States, they've got problems of their own. And a lot of people are thinking, why don't we spend those billions of dollars that we're sending to the Zelensky regime? Why don't we spend them at home on stuff where we could use this help, right? And so this article comes out, and I'll tell you right now, see, Douglas Murray, spoiler alert, Douglas Murray is no longer somebody I admire. In fact, I despise him because of this article. I'm going to read the article in full. And you have to keep in mind, this guy was a trained historian. He went to Eton and Oxford, which is very amusing. It's amusing to me because I went to the same sort of schools that he did, just in different countries. And so I know his class, and I know what he's doing here. And so I'm going to read this article in full, and this is going to be a long video, so, buckle up. I'm going to go through the whole article that he wrote, this front page article in the New York Post, and I'm going to take it apart so you understand what Douglas Murray's program really is. He's now firmly and clearly a propagandist, and this article proves it. So let me read it to you, and I'll explain to you why. In the first paragraph of this thing, he says, Russia is going to lose this war, and Ukraine is going to win it. How can I say that with confidence? Because yesterday I was in the city of Kherson and saw Russia's defeat with my own eyes. Okay, right there, it doesn't make any sense. Why doesn't it make any sense? Well, because Russia wasn't defeated. In fact, Russia held that area of Kherson from late February. They actually had it sewn up by the 1st of March, I believe. And so they held on to that territory, and the Zelensky regime attacked that area on the right bank of the Dnieper River, to the north of the river, if you look at a map, right? They attacked it relentlessly. They threw away countless numbers of soldiers on attacking that, and the Russians held it no problem. When the Russians decided, hey, it's not militarily advantageous for us to hold on to it, then they withdrew. And they withdrew practically overnight. It was that fast. And Douglas Murray himself is going to show you that the Russians had withdrawn. It wasn't a Russian defeat. They just left. But right there, he's giving, at the very outset, a very false impression of how the war is going. Hmm? Let me continue. Kherson is part of the south of Ukraine that was invaded and occupied in March this year. In September, it was one of the 4 regions which the Kremlin gave a vote to in order to pretend that the regions really wanted to be part of Russia, not Ukraine. These plebiscites, actually they were referendums, not plebiscites, but were meant to validate the occupier. But the whole thing was a sham, with results not seen since Saddam Hussein held, quote, elections, end quote, in which he regularly received over 100% of the vote. Well, this is disingenuous. Because you could argue about the percentage insofar as Zaporozhye and Kherson are concerned, but in Lugansk and Donetsk, in those 2 territories that have been consistently shelled by the Kiev regime for the last 8 years, shelled relentlessly every day, and the Kiev regime avowedly saying that they want to kill every Russian person in those 2 regions, which is predominantly Russian. It's like, like in Manhattan, if you'd taken a vote right after 9/11 and asked people, should we invade the country that's responsible for the 9/11 attacks? I bet you would have gotten like 98% vote saying yes. There are times, especially in crisis, where you will get, plus 90% of the vote in one direction or another. This is one of the reasons, because the Ukraine is split ethnically between ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians. So, of course, in a region that is predominantly Russian, there is going to be that kind of, plus 90% outcome of the vote. Okay? So that's disingenuous. The Kremlin thought it was playing a clever game in, quote, making official, end quote, it's gobbling up these vast regions. But all the time, Ukraine, backed by military provisions sent from the West, fought a far cleverer and braver war. Oh, really? Okay. In recent days, the consequences have been paying off. Last week, the Ukrainians managed to take back the city of Kherson and much of the surrounding region, and they did it with barely a fight. So swift was the Ukrainian advance that many Russian soldiers didn't even get the memo that they were meant to have fled the city. That's just not true. In fact, Kherson and that region was evacuated, and there were days when there was nobody there. No army. Okay? So to claim that it was a great Zelensky regime victory, that's an out-and-out lie. Okay. One Russian soldier went into the local shop in the morning to get vodka and turned around to see 2 Ukrainian soldiers behind him. He is now among the prisoners of war that both sides are collecting in preparation for any final peace deal. Now that's an outright lie. That's an outright lie. See? Notice the first phrase. One Russian soldier went into the local shop in the morning to get vodka. Murray is a very clever writer. So he's giving you the impression, by reading this, of course, that all Russians are drunkards who go to the shop in the morning to buy vodka. Okay? That's just the lowest form of propaganda possible, right? Dehumanizing your opponent, saying that he's a drunkard. And by the way, wouldn't Murray say that alcoholism is a terrible disease and we should treat it and be humane and all that crap? And here he is. Okay. That didn't happen. That's just absolute bullshit. And if there was a Russian soldier who was taken as a prisoner of war, there have been, it's inevitable in any war, in any conflict this size, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, we have to wonder if that Russian POW will survive. After all, there's video evidence of just now of 10 Russian soldiers being summarily executed by Zelensky regime forces. So, if this guy exists, which I highly doubt, he's probably not alive now. And you know why. Yet, although the Ukrainians took back the city, as I saw myself, the locals have paid a terrible price. As you drive As you drive towards Kherson, you pass village after village that has been decimated by the Russians. And what about the Zelensky regime forces that were constantly attacking and shelling? And of course, in the combat, they too destroyed the city. It's not just the Russians. It was in a combat zone. It was both sides destroyed it. Okay? Simple rural houses all have their roofs and walls blown off from shelling or from being burned in the resulting fires. They are ghost villages with nothing moving and no one left. Very true. But in the first sentence of that paragraph, he's lying to you. Or, no, he's not lying to you. He's being clever. He's giving you a false notion of what is going on, or of who is responsible. The Russians also like to leave parting gifts as part of their war tactics. All the main roads and many side tracks have been mined, so that cars have to pick their way through as precisely as they can through the same tracks as the cars in front. This is very true, and this is very common. It's very common for a withdrawing army to leave areas mined. Of course they're going to do that, to slow down any advance of the opposing forces that might try to hit them in the back, as it were. Okay, so this is not a surprise. Douglas Murray does not mention the fact that the Zelensky regime has been punitively firing mine shells at Donetsk and Lugansk, and these little pedal mines fall all over the city of Donetsk, where there are only civilians, there's no military. And these little pedal mines, if you're an adult, you'll lose a leg. And if you're a child, you'll be killed. He doesn't mention that. Okay, let me see. Still, the Russians got out of Kherson so fast that the main thing they left was a desperate civilian population overjoyed to be freed from Russian forces. Of course, because many of the people who stayed in Kherson are ethnic Ukrainians. The ethnic Russians, 118,000 of them, left Kherson. He doesn't mention that. And where did they leave to? They left to Russia. They didn't leave to the Zelensky regime. Okay. The population's hope began in October when, in news that went around the world, the Antonovsky Bridge was blown up. This bridge was the last major crossing for Russia to send heavy artillery from the Crimean Peninsula to the south of Ukraine. With that route down, the Russians began to flee, in some places with barely a fight. This is just inaccurate, militarily inaccurate. The Antonovsky Bridge was perfectly fine. The Zelensky regime was certainly shelling it, but the Antonovsky Bridge was still standing. It was the fear that the Zelensky regime would blow up a dam further upstream of the river, and that they would flood the city of Kherson and make it extremely difficult to resupply the 20 to 30,000 soldiers that the Russians had on the right bank of the river. That's what led them to the decision to withdraw from that area of the Kherson region and the city of Kherson itself. Okay, so it's misinformed, and this guy should know better. And further, the Antonovsky Bridge was destroyed not by the Zelensky regime. It was destroyed by the Russians as they withdrew. Because the Antonovsky Bridge was one of the principal supply lines into that area, and that was a big part of the reason that the Russians withdrew. He's misinformed, and he's being disingenuous, and here is an interesting sentence. The bridge was the last major crossing for Russia to send heavy artillery from the Crimean Peninsula to the south of Ukraine. This is just geographically inaccurate. You look at a map, and there is Crimea, the Isthmus of Crimea, and then the region of Kherson on the left bank of the river, to the south of the river, as it were. And then they withdrew from the north side. The Antonovsky Bridge crosses the Dnieper River. So this is geographically inaccurate. This doesn't leave the Ukraine forces a clear road to Crimea, although Crimea is going to pop up a couple of more times in this article, and I'll explain why in just a moment. One of the soldiers who liberated the city told me, quote, "It was something I'll never forget. It was crazy. You could see all the Russian propaganda billboards still, and then everyone who had a Ukrainian flag was waving at us, jumping up and down with relief," end quote. Okay, I'll assume that's accurate. But of course, the local population is traumatized from months of Russian occupation, including the torture and certain killing that are part of the Russian way of war. This is a lie. This is an open lie. The Russians haven't been torturing civilians. It's the Zelensky regime forces who have been torturing civilians. And we know it. And we know that the Zelensky regime targets people for assassination. We know it. They even assassinated one of their own negotiators because they didn't think that he was sufficiently Ukrainian or some shit like that. And they've assassinated human rights activists. They've assassinated mayors. They've assassinated members of the Duma, their parliament rather. And he doesn't mention that. And he says, uncorroborated, that the Russians tortured and terrorized the population. But he doesn't mention the fact that the Russians allowed anyone in the occupied territories to leave to Ukraine. He doesn't mention that. For the past 9 months, the Russians have been letting people in the territories that they have occupied, civilians, they've allowed them to leave. They've created safe passages for them to leave. He doesn't mention this. He's lying. One of the soldiers who liberated the city told... not that one. The city's airport is completely destroyed, with live artillery and RPG cases still lying around. Some of the main municipal buildings were burned down by the Russians as they left. Now, the city airport being completely destroyed, sure, because both sides were shelling the shit out of it during the combat, okay? And once the Russians had captured the airport, they weren't able to repair it because shelling from the other side, because it's war, okay? So that's just extra. Some of the main municipal buildings were burned down by the Russians as they left. Why would they bother? But, okay. That's going to come up in a little bit, okay? But on Friday, in the central square, there was only gratitude and tears, both of joy and grief. There is no electricity in Kherson, and in the bitter winter weather, this and the lack of food makes for the most miserable conditions. That's accurate. I know because I'm here in Kherson. I'm in Kharkov. So, yeah, when there's no electricity and no food in this kind of weather, no. Thousands of locals were queuing patiently in the main square for the rations that were being handed out by the authorities. That's another lie. It wasn't, an orderly queue patiently waiting for supplies. No, it was like a big old scrum. I saw it. I saw videos. And he's seen videos too, because they've been emerging for several days now. The trucks just pull up in the middle of it, and, there's no organization, no troops manning things, and in an orderly way giving food to the civilians. And so the civilians, it's just a big old scrum. It's a nightmare. And it literally becomes, survival of the fittest. Whoever's stronger gets the most stuff, And it's not enough stuff. That's the worst part, okay? So that's bullshit. As I walked around the square speaking to people, many were overcome with emotion. One young 28-year-old woman, Alexandra, just came over, hugged me, and burst into tears. Quote, "You are the first foreign person that I have met for a long time. It's been a long time," end quote. "And what of being free again?" Quote, "It is hard to say. It is very difficult," end quote, she said, and burst into tears and held me again. That's a lie. Come on, how many times have you seen some 28-year-old woman in a war zone just go up to some random foreigner and hug him? That's a big fat fucking lie. You just made it up. It's just bullshit. Or possibly, there's Zelensky regime PR people who are doing this. Notice her comment. It's hard to say. It's very difficult when he asks, what's it like to be free again? She didn't have a prepared answer. So either it's an outright lie, or more likely, actually, now that I think about it, it's some PR chick, suitably attractive, that will go up to Douglas Murray, some random foreigner, as if Ukrainians, have never seen foreigners before. Of course they see foreigners before all the time. Okay? That's bullshit. Other residents of the city had a simpler message, if never a simple story. I told every single person who I met in the square that I am from Britain and America, two of the countries which have done the most to arm the Ukraine forces with the munitions they have used so effectively. They haven't, but the Ukrainian people know that a big part of their success is because friends and allies have come to their aid. Without exception, everybody said the same thing. Spasiba, thank you. Some shook with emotion as they said it, others with quiet dignity. But I do not think I have been hugged by so many women, young and old, in my whole life. All had quiet or flowing tears in their eyes as they tried to express their gratitude to America and her allies for being with the Ukrainian people. That's bullshit. This is just complete bullshit. It's just propaganda fluff. Now, here comes a whopper. One 6-year-old girl came running over to me to hug me and have her mother photograph us. That's a lie. It's a blatant lie. And how do I know this? Huh? Because I have 6-year-old children, or I had. Now they're 7 and 9. Okay? I know exactly how they behave. 6-year-olds, some 6-year-old girl, she'll be terrified of any stranger. She'll hide behind her mother's legs. That happens all the time. So the notion that some 6-year-old girl is just going to run to him and hug him, no. Or a PR stunt. Some woman with a 6-year-old child, and it was prepared. Douglas Murray is sophisticated enough to know such things. Okay? So, yeah, he might have a photograph of himself with some 6-year-old child. Mm-hmm. But it was a PR stunt. And he knows this. He's sophisticated enough and grown up enough. And he's been around the block. Yeah, We were dreaming that the Ukrainian army would come, her mother said, so she could go to school again, end quote. Now, that's another line. Because, see, in Kherson, the schools were open. They were, okay? And how do I know this? Because in other regions that are in not quite close to combat areas, but Kherson certainly, the schools are open. They aren't. So this notion that she could ever go to school again, no. Okay. So living on the 8th floor of one of the city's apartment buildings, the mother said she had not slept all of these months. Now they were free. More propaganda. Of course, it is mainly women queuing because their sons and husbands are still off fighting. The liberation of all of Ukraine is far from complete, though the liberation of Kherson will undoubtedly form a turning point in the conflict. Okay, see, one of the reasons I got into serious trouble at the beginning of this conflict, and part of the reason that the SBU came around to talk to me, was because I had posted on Telegram how I knew for a fact that able-bodied men were fleeing from the cities because they didn't want to be forcibly conscripted. Some of them were heading to Europe, some of them were headed to the countryside in the west, Transnistria and so forth. I knew this for a fact. I mean, business associates of mine in Kiev told me this. They told me, look, man, I'm splitting, okay? Because they're going to try to forcibly conscript me. So the fact that the city of Kherson is empty, 2 reasons. Number one, they were Ukrainian, ethnically Ukrainian, and they split. And number 2, they were ethnically Russian, which meant that they went to Russia. Mm-hmm. That's why there are no men in the city. Okay? And where the liberation of Kherson will undoubtedly form a turning point in the conflict, yes, it will, but not the way Douglas Murray is portraying it, and I'll get to that in just a moment. Though even here, the violence of war is not over. As we stood in the main square, we heard explosions continuously from a variety of distances. Many of these will be mines, either being exploded deliberately to clear the roads or having done what the Russians hoped them to do. But later, as my group, including my French friend, writer and filmmaker Bernard-Henri Lévy, and right there that clues you in that this is a whole propaganda tour, and I'll explain why in a moment, traveled down to the river where the blown-up bridge, the Antonovsky Bridge, lay. It became clear that though the Russians have abandoned Kherson, they have not yet left it alone. Now, Bernard-Henri Lévy is one of these so-called dissidents, rebels, right? The French always have this kind of guy. He's like a rebel, right? But he rebels about trivial stuff. But he constantly tries to get in good with the establishment. See? That's what BHL is all about. He rebels about like sexuality and all kinds of other crap. But insofar as like actually going against the establishment, no. He's the establishment's pet poodle. He's not about, tipping over the apple cart. No. Okay, so the fact that BHL Bernard Henri Lévy is here, that just tells you that this whole thing is a propaganda effort. It has nothing to do with actually finding the truth, which is the point of this video that I'm making. I'll get to that point at the end of having read all this bullshit. Okay, so they went down to the river, to the right bank of the river, the north side of the river, to see it, right? To see the bridge. As our car drove down the Dnieper River, as our car drove towards the Dnieper River, a Russian missile fired in the sky ahead of our car and was intercepted by a Russian missile defense system. That I can't say if it's true or not, because that would have happened. That would have been congruent with the situation. That he just so happened to spot it. Not buying it, buddy. Sorry. Dougie boy, that one, these things happen, sure. And I personally have seen them, okay? But that he saw it just as he was driving down there, I just don't buy it. Anyway, after one of the sharpest U-turns of my life, we got into body armor and headed more cautiously down to the river. By the way, whenever they put on body armor, you know that they're full of shit, see? Because body armor isn't really going to save you if you get hit by shrapnel. If you get a direct hit by shrapnel, like your body armor covers your chest, right, and your back. If you get hit with shrapnel, body armor isn't going to make a lick of difference. You're dead anyway, okay? If not from the shrapnel piercing you and going right through you like butter, right? It'll hit you, and the shock itself will be enough to fuck you up so badly that, you're a goner. So I've always found it laughable, okay, to go with body armor. That's just dumb. It's just like, self-dramatic bullshit. But, he's a dramatic guy. What can I say? Where was it? Okay. Soon the Russians began sending over a range of weapons. There were drones, certainly, simple spy drones sent in order to locate targets, including people. Then there are killer drones, mainly sourced by the Russians from these days from Iran. And then there are the various rockets and missiles that they have all at their disposal still on the other side of the river and on the route to Crimea. Notice Crimea again, which they have occupied since 2014. Some or all of these started to come in over our heads. Okay, I'll buy that. But notice that they bring up Crimea. The Crimea issue. The Crimea issue is the thing that the warmongers in the West are really obsessed about. They want Crimea desperately. That's the thing that they really want. Because they figure that they get a Crimea, they can establish a NATO base there. That's why the Russians took it in 2014. Anyway, soon the whoosh and bang of the explosions became a barrage. Looking to at least see the destroyed bridge, my party managed to attract the attention of a Russian sniper on the other side of the river who took a shot and missed, but it was warning enough. Now that's an outright and open lie. And I'll tell you why I can say. He said here, let me repeat it. Looking to at least see the destroyed bridge, my party managed to attract the attention of a Russian sniper on the other side of the river who took a shot and missed. That is a blatant lie. And how do I know this? Very simple, because where the Antonovsky Bridge is, the river is 1 kilometer wide, 1,000 meters, roughly 950 yards. And so anyone with any kind of military experience or either training military experience or actually, on the ground military experience, can tell you that a sniper from 1,000 yards, 1,000 meters, across a river where all kinds of air currents flow, and so, your bullet will go wherever. That's a lie. It's just a blatant lie. Because, of course, Douglas Murray, is depending on you, thinking that it's just like a little river, like a few dozen meters across. But this thing is like an ocean. It's 1,000 meters across at the Antonovsky Bridge, okay? It's not something that some random sniper is going to even bother with. It's impossible. So that's an open lie. But the lies get bigger, and this next paragraph, here comes the biggest whopper of them all. Okay? It is a reminder of Russia's continued malice. I don't know why it's malice, because it's the war, but okay. But it is not a demonstration of strength. Just as this war has shown the Ukrainian people to be strong, nobody's doubting that the Ukrainian people are strong, but so it has shown the Russian military to be corrupt and inept. Okay? Not that Russia cannot display brutality. Up the road in Mariupol, they have flattened the city, and as many as 80,000 civilians are believed to have been slaughtered. Now that's just the most grotesque lie imaginable. Douglas Murray is claiming that 80,000 civilians are believed to have been slaughtered in the city of Mariupol. No one has ever claimed such a thing. No one. That's a complete and utter lie. It is credibly estimated that something like 30,000 Zelensky regime forces were annihilated at Mariupol. In terms of civilians, they all fled. The notion that 80,000 of them were killed in Mariupol, I mean, just thinking about it casually, if you know anything about this war, you know it's a complete, blatant lie that Douglas Murray is spouting. And it colors the rest of this article. Because you say, oh my God, they killed 80,000 civilians in one city. My God, what are these animals capable of doing? But see, he's counting on your ignorance. This is a complete and utter lie. And I took screen caps of this shit. I don't know if they're going to change it later. Because I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people say, hey, wait, what the fuck are you talking about, dude? Because it's a blatant lie. And he's saying it to color your impressions, to create, well, he's doing it because it's propaganda. And this whole article, as I've shown so far, it's a propaganda piece. And Douglas Murray is sophisticated enough, because I know his educational background, and I have a similar background. And so the fact that he's claiming this, well, he would know better. And the fact that he keeps emphasizing Crimea, because that's what's going on. The neocons in the United States, most especially, and the drones in NATO, they want Crimea desperately. So they're trying to portray this as, the hope of taking Crimea from the Russians. That's never going to happen. It's just geographically impossible. There are over 100,000 troops between where the Zelensky regime forces are currently stationed and the peninsula of Crimea. It's not going to fucking happen. But he keeps pushing that Crimea button. And he keeps pushing this blatant lie that I insist he would know is a lie. He's knowingly peddling lies. Today, as the people of liberated Kherson try to get back in touch with the world, they have questions of their own. Generators have been set up in a couple of places in the center of the city. Mobile phone chargers inevitably pile high from the sockets. The people of the city are speaking to the outside world again, and it is with a mixture of joy and grief. One huge Russian man is sobbing and eventually tells me he and his wife had just managed to speak to his mother in Germany for the first time in months and reassure her that they were alive. That again sounds like a lie. That sounds like a complete lie. And the reason being, electricity wasn't cut in Kherson until the Russians withdrew. And even though the Zelensky regime cut the local cell phone system there, they would have had internet. And so they would have been able to talk to people on Zoom and on Telegram. So this notion that there's this Russian man, and I doubt if it was Russian, because the Russians fled, but Dougie Murray here saying that some Russian man finally got to talk to his mother in Germany after months, that's a lie. That's just a lie. And this information that I'm telling you, it's readily available. Anybody could have told him, okay? So either he's a fool, Douglas Murray is a fool, or he's, once again, knowingly lying. And the fact that he's lying so blatantly about the 80,000 civilians slaughtered in Mariupol, which is an outright lie, proves to me that just about everything he says here, he knows it's a lie, and he's telling it deliberately. An elderly woman in a wheelchair broke down when we spoke, describing how the Russians 3 times raided her apartment, and on the 3rd time, her brother died of a heart attack in terror in front of her. Now, it's impossible to determine if this story is true or not. It's just not possible. We just have to go by Douglas Murray's words, right? But since I think I've shown pretty clearly that he's lied about other stuff, about being shot at by snipers across the Dnieper River at the Antonovsky Bridge, and about the 80,000 slaughtered civilians in Mariupol, I would discount this. I would not bet the ranch on it. Okay, worse stories will come. Of course, they're going to come. Because certain Zelensky regime people are going to set it up so that they emerge. Kherson, like all the other cities that the Russians occupied, will have bodies, including mass graves, not yet discovered. The authorities became very nervous when I asked them about the locations of any graves they had found. Of course they would get nervous because they haven't prepared the grave sites yet. See, when the Russians withdrew from Izium, which it was no longer to their operational advantage, the Zelensky regime came to Izium and found a whole bunch of grave sites. And in these grave sites, and you can see this on Telegram, it's readily available video, you'd see this individual mound with an individual cross with the name of the person and the date that the body had been buried there and some other additional information. In some cases where the identity of the cadaver could not be determined because it was some soldier who had been blown up, right? It was just put there with all the available information with that cross, of these wooden crosses in the middle of a forest. It was actually very dramatic. It looked actually very peaceful, okay? But they were not mass graves like you think of, like some giant hole dug out by some, like bulldozer or something, and all the bodies just dumped there. It wasn't that at all. But he's playing, Douglas Murray, he's playing on your imagination. See, because you hear mass graves, and that's what you think. You don't think of simply a spontaneous, grave site where individual graves are dug for each of the bodies and with crosses there for each of them. You don't think of it in those terms, okay? This is propaganda bullshit by Dougie here. By the way, the authorities became very nervous when I asked them about the locations of any graves they had found. Yeah, because they're trying to manufacture Russian human rights abuses, and they're probably still in the process of that. And so, of course, they got nervous because they're not sure yet how they're going to play it up to maximum PR advantage. So Douglas Murray's PR handlers, they got very nervous because they didn't quite know the answer to that because they hadn't made the decision yet of how they were going to play it up. Yeah. The people of the city did not know yet which of their Russian which of their sons were taken by war and which were taken, tortured, and murdered like people everywhere in Russian forces have occupied. Now, again, that's another line. Because, see, the Russians don't really give a shit about you or me or anybody, okay? Or the Zelensky regime, for that matter. They don't give a shit about people, individuals, unless they fuck with their shit. This is the reality of war, okay? Reality of war, I mean, shit, I lived in the Pinochet dictatorship, right? You could say whatever the fuck you wanted, and nobody cared, right? If you started fucking with the military and fucking with their shit, like blowing up stuff or doing anything that you shouldn't have, then they fucked with you, then they grabbed you and tortured you and did God knows what to you. But if you just mouthed off or whatever, or just lived your life as just a normal human being, they didn't mess with you. That's the rule. You don't mess with them, they don't mess with you. Okay? And so all this shit that Dougie Murray is saying here, propaganda bullshit. Hundreds of civilian bodies were found in a mass grave in Izium only recently. It was that mass grave that I was telling you about. Okay? I mean, see? He's saying something that as I tell it to you, you realize, oh, yeah, it was just probably all the dead bodies from combat. Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian civilians, Russian soldiers, and they were all buried there because, where else are you going to put them, right? And you're not going to ship them back to Russia. Well, the Russian soldiers, the dead Russian soldiers, were shipped back to Russia. But the Ukrainian forces that were killed in combat, what are you going to do with them? So, of course, they were buried there, okay? But he's playing it up like it's human rights abuses, atrocities. And, of course, he doesn't mention, not once in this fucking article, about how the Zelensky regime continues relentlessly shelling civilian areas in the city of Donetsk, in the region of Lugansk. He doesn't mention this at all. And he knows it. He's sophisticated enough to know it. See? The actual human rights abuses that the Zelensky regime commits, he flips it around and aims it back at the Russians. See, the Russians did this. In the meantime, the Russians will keep trying to add to the casualties. On the road out of the city, there were reports of Russian drones dropping cluster bombs on the road we were taking out. I find that hard to believe, but okay. And by the way, I don't think there were cluster bombs. I think that it was phosphorus. Mm-hmm. I've seen a lot of video of the Russians dropping phosphorus on what they believe to be concentrations of Ukrainian troops. It's actually proving that withdrawing from Kherson was a smart move, because now for the Ukraine forces, the Zelensky regime has to take this area, but it's coming at tremendous cost because they're sitting ducks for Russian artillery and Russian anti-personnel weaponry like the phosphorus, right? And so, it's basically a poison pill. And politically, they are forced to take Kherson and occupy it. And they're going to have to deal with all these civilians that are still left there. There are not that many. The city of Kherson had, I believe, a population of I think it was about 240,000. A big chunk of them left when the conflict started back in February. And like I said before, 118,000, mostly ethnic Russians, evacuated before the Russian army evacuated from it. So how many people are left in the city of Kherson? I would guesstimate maybe 40 to 60,000. And so the Zelensky regime is going to have to deal with them. That's why they're telling them. They're telling them now to evacuate Kherson and go elsewhere, because the city is becoming a poison pill for the Zelensky regime. But Dougie Boy here doesn't mention that. Well, in fairness, he probably didn't realize it at the time that he was writing this, and few people have. I bet the Russian military had figured this out before they made a fucking move, but that's another story. Where I lost my place here. Hang on a second. The only way to avoid... Oh, yeah. He talks about cluster bombs. I don't think the Russians have used cluster bombs. I mean, phosphorus, yeah, and phosphorus is nasty shit. That stuff gets on you, it's like napalm, and it burns right through anything. It's a horrifying way to die. But cluster bombs, I don't think so, but I could be wrong. So the only way to avoid them is to drive as fast as possible along roads littered with the debris of tanks, shells, empty cases of ammunition, and more. It should make anybody think. Now, that's inaccurate. That's not true. See, when you come to an area that you suspect might be mined, you drive as slow as possible. You don't drive fast, of course, because it's more likely you're going to get blown up, man. So him saying that they drove as fast as possible meant that that road was secure. Oh, yeah, there were debris of tanks and blown up APCs and the rest of it. But that it was mined, you don't drive down a road that's mined or you suspect might be mined at full speed. You don't. You'd be a fool to do so. I mean, suicidal, right? What has happened in Ukraine is a 20th century war taking place in the 21st century. At the places of fiercest fighting, which is nearly everywhere, there are trenches and dugouts that look like something from World War I. Very accurate. As a debate on the funding of the Ukraine war comes up in front of the newly Republican-dominated House of Representatives, a question continues here at home. Is this our war? And here we come to the gist of this article. The answer is basically yes. There are many of the left who think not. They see it as just a war between white people without the racial tones that are the only thing that produce horror in the modern left. See, I mean, that's the kind of thing that got me interested in Murray to begin with and thought that he was, our guy. He's not. He's their guy, the narratives guy. But the modern right has its own objections. They point not just to the undoubted corruption that has existed in Ukraine, but endlessly make the point that we are spending money abroad that we should be spending at home. And that's the point of this article. He's basically advocating for more money for Ukraine, more war, more money for the military-industrial complex. Douglas Murray is sophisticated enough to know this. He understands that his mission is to prop up the Zelensky regime, show that they're winning, quote unquote, so that more money will go to the military-industrial complex. That's what Murray's program really is. As though anyone honestly believes that a Republican or Democrat administration that stops sending arms to Ukraine would immediately use that cash to build a wall at the southern border of the U.S.? There is a dishonesty and a frivolity, There is a dishonesty and a frivolity in such claims. Pot, meet, kettle. Had Vladimir Putin succeeded in his aim of overrunning Ukraine, we know other countries would have been next. Now, Vladimir Putin was never interested in overrunning Ukraine. Everybody knows that. I mean, he said it at the very beginning. And everybody with any kind of military sophistication, even the most basic level, knows that that wasn't his intention. That's why he's left all of Western Ukraine alone. That's why for 9 months, they haven't been hitting the electrical infrastructure, which supplied weapons and men from the West to the Eastern Front. So he knows that that's not accurate. Nobody now believes that he can swallow up the Baltic states or Moldova. He is looking stretched to even defend Crimea. Again, Crimea, Crimea, Crimea. Crimea is achievable. He keeps trying to insist this, which is a lie. He wants to widen the war. That's what he's about. Okay? And he's dangling this notion that the Russians are interested in the Baltic states or Moldova, which is laughable. They're not. The Russians are certainly not interested in the Baltic states. If they were interested in the Baltic states, they would have taken them by now. Okay? They're not that fucking big. Certainly much smaller than these regions of Ukraine. Look at a map, at one of those maps that compares geographical size, and look at the 3 Baltic states. They're not even a sliver of what the Russians currently have of Ukraine territory. Okay? So he's dangling this boogeyman that, Vladimir Putin is going after the Baltic states and he's going to go after Poland and then France and Germany, like bullshit, propaganda. And the Chinese, he is looking stretched to even defend Crimea, which, again, the Crimea issue. And the Chinese Communist Party and other hungry powers have learned something too. They have learned that the civilized world means it when we say that there are some atrocities so appalling, some crimes of war so terrible, that they cannot be permitted. See, this whole conflict, which has resulted in the displacement of conservatively some 15 million Ukrainians and the death, for sure, of at least 120,000 Ukrainian soldiers. This is because NATO, because of the people paying Douglas Murray to write this bullshit. And so he claims that, these atrocities are so appalling. Who caused it? It was NATO who caused it. We talk about, quote, never again, end quote. In Ukraine, the West has shown that it is a promise we can act on. As I hear the newly formed House debate the wisdom of arming the Ukrainians, I will have other sounds in my ear. That's what it says. I think it's a typo. Not just the sounds of war, but the sounds of freedom, the sounds of a free people, weeping with gratitude that America, Britain, France, and others did not free them, but rather helped a proud and courageous people to free themselves. Now, that's the full article. I read it, typos and all, and I'm going to tell you right now, it's just propaganda. And see, this brings me to an issue that I want to emphasize. See, a true dissident, and this is my last say, by the way, a true dissident, a person who is truly against the narrative bullshit of the wokesters, the narrative, the establishment, the deep state, all those fucking people, right? The cosmopolitan leadership class that does not care about the people of the West. See, a true opponent of that whole cabal is interested in the truth. And if it benefits one side or another side, it doesn't really matter. That's not the point. The point is to get at the truth so that we can see reality as it is. And I had thought before this article that Douglas Murray was more or less on the side of the angels, right? Now I know different. See, this guy, he came on a prepared PR excursion to Kherson to create this article that was on the front page of the New York Post to prop up support for Ukraine, for the Zelensky regime. Not Ukraine, really, because they don't give a shit about the Ukraine, about the nation of Ukraine, or the people of Ukraine. If they cared about it, they would have negotiated months ago. They would have negotiated back in March, as they were doing, as the Zelensky regime was doing. And it was in early April that Boris Johnson came to Kiev and told Zelensky to drop all negotiations with the Russians, that they had to fight to the death. And Zelensky, as part of this cosmopolitan leadership class that does not care about the people of their own countries, he said, yes, sir, and kept on fighting and throwing lives away in this pointless conflict, which could have been solved months ago. It could have been solved years ago if France and Germany and the United Kingdom had obliged Ukraine to live up to the Minsk II agreements. What were the Minsk II agreements? The Crimea is Russian forevermore, and there would be autonomy and self-rule for the regions of the Donbass, which would remain a part of Ukraine, but would have political autonomy and be able to speak their own language and not be shelled every fucking day by the Kiev regime. See? Douglas Murray knows this. See? And he's saying that it's all Russia's fault because he's propping them up, propping up the neocons, propping up the warmongers. And so Douglas Murray is of a type of guy in the West that you should be aware of. People like, people like Matt Taibbi, people like Ben Shapiro, people like Sam Harris, who pretend to be dissidents of the narrative in one little very narrow area. But when it comes to war making, when it comes to the serious stuff, when it comes about protecting and looking after the best interests of the people of the West, they're with the narrative, with that cosmopolitan leadership class. Because people like Doug Murray care more about money and prestige and being in good with the right crowd as opposed to actually helping people. Douglas Murray looks at the Ukrainian, and you can tell he looks at the Ukrainian people as, the little hoi polloi. Look at them, in the little war, the little, Slavic peasants. That's how he looks at them. You can tell by the tone of his article. And they all do, those aforementioned people, they pretend to be dissidents. And they pretend from the safety of their book deals, from the safety of being in the West, in with the right crowd, getting money, all kinds of money, from rich oligarchs to prop themselves up and pretend to be in opposition. It's controlled opposition. It's not real opposition. Not real opposition to this cosmopolitan leadership class that wants more war so they can make more money and acquire more control over more resources. Because this whole war is about resources, control of resources. Ukraine is a very rich country, extremely rich in natural resources and human resources, and yet it's one of the poorest countries in Europe. Why do you think that was? Because it was being exploited by the Ukrainian oligarchs who were plugged in to this establishment in the West. And so like vampires, they suck the resources out of Ukraine, and they want to do the same thing to Russia. Douglas Murray is sophisticated enough to know this. Instead, he, drapes himself in this flag of principles, of never again, and all this bullshit, to hide the fact that he's just an empty propagandist, like all these people are, that I mentioned before. And there are lots more. And they always seem to be, telling you the truth. But they lie. I've shown you. And these, the little lies, like, him being under fire by some sniper on the other side of a kilometer-wide river, right? It's just stupid, right? To the big lie of saying that in Mariupol, 80,000 civilians were slaughtered by the Russians, which is an outright lie. It's a total lie. And he knows it. And he doesn't mention the fact that the Russians, ever since they captured Mariupol after that battle back in, April, May, they've been rebuilding that sucker. Like, it looks incredible. I've seen video. And it's too much for you to say, oh, they're faking it. Jesus Christ, that's new CGI. That's pretty fucking good. You should call up, Marvel Comics. They could use that kind of really good CGI instead of the crap that they use now. But anyway, the serious point I'm making, this guy is just a propagandist. And that's why I despise him. See? Because you have to let the chips fall where they may. You need to see the truth as it actually is. Because only by knowing the truth can a people in a democracy make wise decisions? If you are lied to, especially by people who set themselves up as people whom you can trust, then a democratic people will not be able to make the correct decisions. The correct decision for the West is very obvious. End the support of the Zelensky regime, have the Russians and the Zelensky regime negotiate some sort of peace agreement, and dedicate those resources to the people of the West who are truly beginning to suffer. The people in Germany, they're going to go cold and hungry this winter. They're going to be rolling blackouts. In the UK, Douglas Murray's birthplace, right? It's credibly estimated that 1 in 5 elderly people will go cold this winter. That's the truth. And yet the Brits, the Americans, everybody's still throwing weapons at the Zelensky regime. And for what? Barack Obama himself said that the Russians have escalatory dominance in Ukraine. They can do whatever they want. And they are going to do whatever they want. They have been doing whatever they want. They have been doing what they set out to do. Because if you actually listen to Putin's February 24th speech, what he wanted was, number one, the liberation of the Donbass from the genocidal maniacs in Kiev, denazification, and demilitarization. Demilitarization, simply put, is the absolute destruction of the Ukraine armed forces. And the Russians are achieving those goals. And this propagandist, Douglas Murray, he pretends to be your friend, but he's lying to you. That's why I despise him. And I know for a fact because back when I was in my elite university, I read Dante's Inferno. There is a special circle in hell for people like Douglas Murray. Know what's going on.